Hello, I'm Christian Hines, and this is my session called Getting Graphic Resisting Anti-Blackness via the Visual Narratives of Black Youth. So, I just wanted to give you a little background information on me. I am a current doctoral student at The Ohio State University. I study secondary English education, literature for children and young adults, and curriculum and instruction. You can find me online for any questions, comment, or any cool book recs, or to just talk about nerd stuff in general. I'm on Twitter at Miss Hines 813, and I'm on Instagram tracking my dog school saga through Tales from the Dock Side. All right, so let's get into this. So, our objective for today, we're going to think critically about the way we can center stories of Black kids, specifically Black joy, in comics and graphic novels and their uses in the classroom. So, that is our overall objective for what we'll be going through in this session. Just to give you kind of an outline, here's our overview for my talk for today. So we'll be taking up a stance, thinking about the importance of this work in relation to resisting educational reform. We're going to be talking about cultural visibility. It's more than just reading, so using criticality and lenses and working that 2020 vision. And then we'll be getting into some classroom practices. So moving beyond reading to engagement, pedagogy, and activism, because reading is fun, but also what are we doing with these books in these classrooms and how are we using these books to affirm the identities of our Black students? So I wanted to start off with a quote by Bettina Love, one of my favorite abolitionist educators. Bettina Love says, "Education can't save us. We have to save education. Tweaking the system is not enough. The goal of abolitionist teaching is freedom, freedom dreaming, and Black joy." So the freedom to create your reality where uplifting humanity is at the center of all decisions. So I just want you to keep this quote in mind as I'm going through my talk. So when I'm thinking about focusing in on books that center narratives about freedom, about Black joy, and thinking about how these narratives can uplift not only our Black students, but uplift humanity and affirm their identities within our classroom in order to embrace our beautiful Black students. So I wanted to give you, because we're talking about comics, I wanted to tell you my origin story. And I have another quote. You'll see that throughout this entire presentation. I really love quotes and words. So Zetta Elliott talks about how Black people have to dream ourselves into existence. We can reimagine, reshape, and restore the colonizing literature that we read and that we teach in schooling spaces. So when I think about my own origin story, because every comic and every graphic novel hero usually comes with a really good origin story, I think about my foray into teaching. So I love kids, I love comics, I just love books in general, but I've always been enamored with comics, particularly superhero stories. And I wanted someone to save me from my everyday realities like chores, homework, and then eventually I wanted to be the one that was saving the day. So I wanted to do some good. And for me, teaching is where I found my place to do some good. The only thing is that I never really saw superheroes that look like me. So when you think about the traditional superhero or the more prominent superheroes, think about what superheroes come to mind. So when we think about what superheroes come to mind, you probably thought of like Wolverine, Batman, Superman, Captain America, Spider-Man, these very prominent characters in the DC and Marvel universe. And then when you think about these characters, what is one thing that just sticks out about them that is shockingly visible about them is that they're white characters. So when I thought about superheroes and where superheroes come in at, I'm like, okay, well, I don't see myself in a superhero. So maybe I need to look at a superheroine. So when I think about like superheroines and who were these females who were saving the day, I started going through the list when I'm younger, thinking about Wonder Woman, Supergirl, Batgirl, and Black Widow. And when we think about these heroes, we still have these same things between superheroes and superheroine. They're still these visible, very white characters. And then if we did have a Black heroine, it was Storm from the X-Men. But Storm didn't even enter the conversation until 1975. And also, she was an adult. She wasn't a teenage superhero. And as we progressed, we got more Black superheroes, but they were usually regulated to the sidelines, unless we had a few solo characters like Black Panther, Black Lightning, or Luke Cage. Or we had some of the Black sidekick characters like Falcon and War Machine. And it kept coming back to me like, where are these teenage superheroes? Where are children in this narrative? And where are Black children, Black adolescents within this narrative? So then I started thinking, well, where are the Black teen superheroes? And of course, we have Shuri, Black Panther's little sister, but she wasn't created until 2005. So she's there for our current generation, but she didn't always exist. And then we have Thunder and Lightning, who were also from the early 2000s, who are Black Lightning's daughter. And I know it's a lot of superhero talk, but I promise it's all going to go somewhere very fun and very important. So when I was thinking about the Black kids and the Black kids superheroes, and I'm thinking about how they aren't really present in this narrative. So where are all the Black kids? Where are the teenagers? And how can they save the world? Or if they aren't saving it, how are they existing and navigating this world with these very white heroes who are always there to save the day? So I want you to keep some of those questions in mind as we go through. So when we're talking about our taking up a stance, we want to check out our foundation before we start building. So some considerations when I think about introducing comics and graphic novels into the classroom as a former high school English teacher and now a current teacher educator at The Ohio State, some of the things I think about is what can we learn from history, particularly Black excellence, to reimagine curriculum and instruction? And then what does it mean to always be on the outside looking in? So what does it mean for minorities and marginalized people to always be on in the margins and looking in to see where they fit? And then also, what are we teaching when we teach Black literature? And which texts can highlight specific insights into the Black experience? So, some of the texts that I engage in when I'm reflecting on these questions are Goldie Muhammad, Bettina Love, With Great Power Comes Great Pedagogy, and Teaching Visual Literacy. These are a lot of the texts that I like to consider when I'm thinking about the literature that I want to bring into my classroom. And I also want to think about how can my students show up in literature and how can I make sure my pre-service teachers truly see and honor the dynamic lives of these tiny and medium-sized humans that they'll be interacting with daily. And also because I'm a person, my place of understanding and educating comes in the form of books. So I look at books and look at who are the characters reflecting, whose stories are being told. And if I'm a teacher or a teacher educator, are the students that I'm teaching or preparing my teacher educators to teach truly reflected within this literature? So, some of the quotes, once again, that I want you to think about is when we're talking about rationales for using comics and graphic novels in the classroom, we like to think about this quote from David Lowe is thinking about comics as meaningful text and what is obstinately left off the page. It provides students with the ideal medium for exploring a wide range of literacies and for taking an agentennial role in meaning making. And also, students of all backgrounds must see themselves reflected in the books that they read, though it remains critically important that they also have the opportunities to delve into the racial and ethnic background of others. So for me, it's more than just reading the literature, but using comics and graphic novels, having this visual literacy, this visual representative of these Black kids is also important for students to be able to engage in this literature and affirm their identities and see new perspective and new ways of being within these pages. So also there was another question of what are we really centering when we're thinking about Black literature? So too often English language arts can center Black trauma and pain via the literature that is chosen. So taking up an anti-racist teaching stance pivots us towards the direction of adding books that center Black joy. So one of the more popular books in the last few years has been The Hate You Give, which is a phenomenal book written by Angie Thomas, and it's often either paired with To Kill a Mockingbird, or sometimes it's supplemented or it replaces To Kill a Mockingbird. But as wonderful as this book is, we also have to think about when we're teaching this book, what are we centering? Because this book still covers a lot of Black pain and Black trauma when we talk about police brutality and the shooting of an unarmed Black kid. So having this book is important, but this shouldn't be our one-stop shop. We also want to include books that center Black joy, that shows Black kids as nuanced and having everyday lived experiences of their peers. So, by teaching children the relationships between texts, they are reading their lives and we help them read the world through the word. So, if we're always giving them traumatic text and texts that show them in negative lights, how are we teaching them to read the world? How are we teaching them to see themselves in the world? Are we teaching them through a traumatic lens? Or are we also showing them that, yes, there are racial things that happen, but there are also things like falling in love, hanging out with your friends by your locker, going to the movies, things that are just joyful and everyday and nuanced. And this is your position in the world. So, some of the critical literacies and anti-racist teaching points that I wanted to focus on is first, when we're thinking about bringing in comics and graphic novels, especially books that center Black adolescence and Black joy, we want to consider the implied reader. So, we want to think about what Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop uses in her metaphor mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So we use mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors to recognize our positionality. So we want to think about, do we have an insider view or are we reading from an outside perspective? So students can use this metaphor like for the mirrors to see their own reflection, windows to see through the lives of others, and a sliding glass door as an entryway. But even when we're thinking about this metaphor, we want to think about, but what happens if the mirror is cracked, or the window doesn't open all the way, or the sliding glass door is locked? So if there's problems within this metaphor, i.e., using Black trauma, we don't want to have a cracked window. We want to be able to show the perspective of Black adolescents, and we want to show the full humanity of Black adolescents. So Ibram X. Kendi has a quote where he says, be aware of your place in the world. So as educators, we have to be aware of our place in the world, and we have to have our students be aware of their place in the world. And we also want to use graphic novels as a visual disruption, to be able to see these visual narratives, to be able to see these kids existing within this world and not just reading words on the page. And then also it works towards decolonizing the traditional literary canon, and it worked towards bringing in inclusive, representative, and equitable pieces of literature. So we can also include like movies, games, books, and think about when we're decolonizing our literature canon and disrupting our literature canon, how do we also move away from just traditional print, traditional words on a page? So once again, these graphic novels, these books, these video games, and then working to become literate about society or a specific group by reading in between the line. And then we also want to take into consideration of our characters who are usually regulated to the margins. And we want to think about whose story gets told, who gets to tell the story, and does it matter to others? And for us, well, at least for me, examining Black kids in comics and graphic novels is strategic. So it aids in not homogenizing the Black experience. And it also helps to decenter whiteness. So decentering these superheroes, decentering the white experience, and highlighting the Black experience and what it means to have Black adolescents. And then also not approaching the narrative of Black boys and Black girls from a deficit view, because our Black boys and Black girls often suffer from adultification bias, where instead of being treated as children, they're treated as adults. They're seen less innocent, and they're usually perpetuated as like the outsider or the monster. So we want to move past just reading and being able to get comfortable with being uncomfortable as we engage in these narratives and evaluate whether we're presenting full dynamic identities within our classroom. Okay, so when we also want to talk about comic and graphic novels and visual literacy. So comics and graphic novels are tools that help us to enact multi-literacies to analyze visual stories. We have panels, transitions, gutters, different perspectives, time, spatial events, sequences. Students are able to make inferences, they can make predictions, they can look at both the narrative and they can look at words and images. So it goes beyond just teaching skills. Our students live in a visual world, so it benefits them to bring in these multimodal and pictorial texts. So when we're having them look at these images, they're able to foster understanding, retain information, and monitor their learning. So it gives a kind of permanence to their meaning making. And they're used to visual strategies that we've taught in the class. Because if you think about like concept maps, flow charts, word webs, plot roller coasters, students are used to this and they're being taught how to read visually. And we want to continue to foster that visual literacy and that multi-level visual analysis by bringing comics into the classroom. because when they're looking at panels, they're able to analyze these images, they're able to look at text, color, body language, and facial experiences. And when they're reading from gutter to the side, they're able to look at the positioning of perspectives of multiple characters, and they're able to analyze time through these spatial and sequence events. So it allows for interpretation, coding, and comprehension. So the next thing I want to talk about is cultural visibility, because you can't build a bridge if you don't know what's on the other side. So I want to take this moment to kind of lead us through a few exercises of the benefits of having comics and graphic novels in the classroom by analyzing two comics that I like to use. One is Moon Girl, which is Lunella Lafayette. She's an African American girl. She's introduced in her very first comic that came out in 2015. She's a super genius. She's a fourth grader. And she has conscious transferal powers. And then we also have Riri Williams, who's also an African American teenager. She's introduced in the Invincible Iron Man, but she got her solo series in 2018. She's a super genius. She's an engineer. She's an inventor, and she kind of steps in for Iron Man. And she's the first 15-year-old to ever get admitted into MIT. So first off the hand, looking at their identities, we already have two super genius Black girls who their superhero level comes from their intellect. It comes from their genius. Both of them are scientists, they're engineers, they're inventors. So we're already disrupting what some negative stereotypes that may be perpetuated by Black girls, because now we have these two Black girls who are Black girls in STEM who are also being able to save the day. So we want to kind of look at how does the positionality of these characters either honor or problematize international notions of cultural identity, specifically Black identity. So when we're reading these comics, we're having students analyze like clothes, food, language, music, and being able to be immersed in these two worlds. So when we're looking at this panel, which stars Lunella Lafayette from Moon Girl, we can kind of talk our students through by just from looking at this panel, what's some characterization things that you can pull out about Lunella? Just looking at it, what do these three panels tell us about Lunella? So being able to break down these panels from the very first one on the left, we can kind of see number one, she likes space, she likes science. We see the planets hanging at the top. Her bedroom is kind of messy, so we know that she can be a little all over the place. We move to the second panel, we see her working on some type of experiment, some type of invention. So we know she's an inventor, and then she's trying to get ready for school. So we know once again, it kind of goes to her messy room that she's kind of frantic. She has to get ready for school. She throws on skates and she is headed out of the door. So already we can see a girl who likes to create, a girl who expands her mind because she likes science, a girl who is messy, and a girl who is also late to school. All of these very normal things that come along with Black adolescence, that come along with adolescence period of with being a normal child and moving into young adulthood. So as we move to this next set, we now see Lunella in a completely different scenario. So now she is in school. So she's in school, she's writing, her teacher is asking her questions. And as we're looking through this panel, and I know like it may not be large enough to you see, but the context of this panel is her teacher is asking her a question about science and evolution, and Lunella goes on to try to give her this very detailed not experience, explanation, and then her teacher cuts her off, and her peers kind of make fun of her. So Lunella is now in this place where her intellect isn't valued in class, and it's also obstructed by the teacher, and then she's made fun of by her peers. So we kind of look at what is it saying about educators within the classroom, and what does it say about Black kids when they're in the classroom and enacting in an educational space, and what that looks like for them. So now we can have students analyze, well, what does it mean for you to be in school? Or have you ever had an experience where a teacher didn't really hear you or you didn't really feel seen? And what does that mean to you? And how does that feel? And then we move to the far right panel where Lunella is trying to explain to her parents about how she feels misunderstood and she doesn't feel like she can fit in. And her parents are really encouraging her to try to just be low key and under the radar, and they're not really hearing her. So once again, we can have a discussion with our students about how does it feel to not be seen or not be heard? And let's talk about ways that we can change that. Or have you ever felt like you were all alone and isolated, and what would be some ways to help? So we also, once again, have this identity of what it means to be a Black kid in school and how this is depicted on the page. And this can open up further discussion for the Black students in your class and students in general of what does it mean to not be affirmed in these educational spaces. So then our next set, we move on to Riri. So there's a bunch of different things that are going on within Riri's panel. So she is, like I said, a 15-year-old who's in this college setting. She's at MIT, she's creating. So there's a huge age gap for her because she feels like an outsider because there are these college kids and these adults, and she's learning how to navigate this world of being a young girl and being in college. And then she also has to navigate trying to be a superhero as well and protect her community in Chicago and save the day, but also still making time in the far right panel to interact with her family and her friends and still engage in Black joy. So being able to have this conversation with students about what does it mean to navigate multiple worlds when you're being a teen. Have you ever felt like an outsider? Have you ever felt like you had a lot on your plate, and how do you balance within your life? So being able to talk about these two girls, both Lunella and Riri, and how their identities are shown on the page in order to promote discussion within the classroom. So I know I was talking a lot about superheroes, and legitly you may have questions like, well, Christian, what if I'm not into superheroes? I get it. That is a legit question. Everybody is not a Marvel and DC person. You have a legitimate question. And then you might also say, well, Christian, what if my students aren't into superheroes? Okay, that's cool. But also, your students aren't really into Shakespeare and a lot of canonical things that are taught, but we bring them into the classroom to show lessons so they can also gain lesson and gain knowledge from superheroes. But I want to take your concerns into consideration. So I hear you. I hear you. So you might also be like, well, what if they can't relate? They may not be able to relate to the superhero part, but they can relate to the identity part and the adolescence part and being able to find their way. So I might kind of let you solve that question, but I'm not going to back down. So then you might hit me with the double whammy like, all right, Christian, that Marvel DC stuff is absolutely too much. I wouldn't even know where to start. Like, that's not my bag. That's not my wheelhouse. And to that, I'll be like, all right, you got me. You got me. This kind of goes into the superhero thing. It's not your thing. But you know what? I hear you. I hear your questions. I hear your concerns. And I want you to know I got you. I got you. I promise you, I got you. So, to that, I want to go into the heart of this conversation, which is also showing Black adolescents within comics and graphic novels and their lived everyday experience. So, yes, we had these Black superheroes, but we also have comics and graphic novels that highlight the everyday lived experiences of Black adolescents. So, I want to go through these four comics and graphic novels that I would recommend that you would use in your classroom, and I recommend them to my teacher educators. So, we have The New Kid by Jerry Craft, which features Jordan Banks, and it's the story of a biracial Black kid and how he navigates his home world and going to a more affluent school and being a new kid in school. In middle school, we have twins, Francine and Maureen Carter, which is about two twin girls who are transitioning from elementary to middle school and trying to find their identity outside of each other as identical twins. We have The Crossover, which is actually a verse novel that was turned into a graphic novel, excuse me, and that's by Kwame Alexander. And then we also have another novel by Jerry Craft. It's kind of a companion piece to New Kid called Class Act, and it follows Drew Ellis, a peer of Jordan Banks, and how he navigates his school world. And I really enjoy Class Act because, in comparison to New Kid, Class Act also covers like colorism and what it means to be tokenized and what it means when teachers have to go through diversity training. All of these are really great books, and they really show the everyday lived experiences of Black adolescents and Black youth. And they talk about things from code switching to microaggressions to finding your voice to dreaming of college. They deal with grief, they deal with hair issues, different jazz music vocabulary. So we're going to just take a few scenes from each book and how this can be used and how we use these to talk about Black adolescents. So our first panel comes from the New Kid, and it shows a couple of different scenes within New Kid. So we have this very first panel on the left where Drew is in class and the teacher calls him by another Black kid's name, DeAndre, and he corrects her and tells her that's not my name, but she follows up with, oh, well, DeAndre was one of my former students and he was really a handful. So now we have this white teacher who's called this Black student by another different Black name, but also her memories of her previous Black student weren't always a positive memory, which she is now associating with this new kid. And then we see Jordan at the bottom, and Jordan kind of talks about how that teacher has often called like Black kids by a different name or a previous name. And then we kind of jump into the middle section, this middle panel where we have Maury, another Black kid, and they call him Morio. And he's called that because they rhyme it with Oreo. And they talk about the euphemism of how some Black kids and what it means to be Black, or how some Black nerds may not always be seen as really Black. So they're called Oreos because it's like they're Black on the outside and white on the inside. So thinking about that construct of an Oreo. And then in the far right panel, we have Maury and his friend at a book fair, and the teacher is recommending books. And to the white kid, she kind of gives him this book that's filled with magic and fantasies and futuristic worlds. And then to Maury, she gives these really traumatic Black narratives like the mean streets of South Uptown. It's a gritty tale of survival, and it's about how a kid had to find his way through the mean streets to come up in the world. And so she naturally assumes, because Maury is Black, that he's used to tales of tragedy and triumph, and he doesn't get a chance to have that fantastical world. So being able to just have these three panels and discuss within class like what it means to be a Black kid in school and what it means to be Black adolescents, from talking about names to the Oreo construct to not being able to be a kid because teachers see you in a different light, and also being able to challenge some of our beliefs and biases as educators. So thinking about how we can use these panels in ways to interrogate schooling spaces, and then to also think about how schooling spaces can add to Black trauma and Black stereotypes. So then we want to also look at another panel from New Kid where Jordan kind of describes his bus ride because he goes to a more affluent school on the other side of town. So we kind of look at code switching and how Jordan does these transitions the further he gets from his neighborhood and the closer he gets to his school. So we kind of look at the first panel and how he has to maintain a certain facade as he's riding the bus. He has his hood on. As he moves to another neighborhood, he kind of takes his hood off, but he's still kind of withdrawn into himself. And then as he moves throughout the neighborhood, depending on the people that he sees, some people ostracize him, some people accept him, and then he kind of starts smiling in order to seem non-threatening. And then finally he gets to his school where he's seen as being cool, but he's already had to go through so many transitions on just an early morning bus ride to even get to school. So that brings up another conversation of having in the classroom of what it means to be Black and what Black students have to go through in order to even show up to school before they even get into school. And then once they're in school, the things that they have to keep up and maintain in order to just exist. So this is a very, very good panel that can spark a lot of discussion on the identity of Black adolescents. And kind of keeping up with that theme, we see Maureen and Francine as they're going through school. It's their first day of sixth grade. They're identical twins. And one of the twins, Francine, she's trying to establish her identity away from her identical twin. So instead of dressing alike, she decides to dress different. She puts a hat on, but her friends only see her and her twin as one person. So they're often mistaken for each other. They're often talked about as one person. They're not seen as individual identities. So that can play into a lot of different things, even being outside of twins, like how our Black kids always lump together. If one Black kid does one thing, they can be naturally associated with another kid who looks like them or just has the same skin as them. So how do we look at combating those type of biases and discrepancies in the classroom? And then one of my favorites, which is the crossover when we're talking about affirming positive Black identities. So there's Josh Bell, and Josh is telling us how he came to be and the reason why he has his locks. So he has these dreadlocks, he plays basketball, and he talks about a few of his idols and how he came to love his locks. So he talks about Lil Wayne, 2 Chainz, and Wale, and how his locks make him feel like a king. They make him feel regal. He talks about how his locks feel when he's watching his dad play basketball. He's talking about his mother and father's relationship and how his twin brother is different from him because he has a shaved head. So when we're looking at this panel and how Josh talks about the regality of his hair, he talks about his family, he talks about his love of basketball, we can use this panel to bring into the classroom. How do depictions in this panel challenge the deficit views of Black kids and Black family? Josh comes from a 2-parent home. Josh loves his hair. He has a strong sense of who he is. He's able to connect why he loves his hair, what he loves about it, and how it makes him feel about himself and how it creates his identity. So when we're thinking about all of these different personalities that we've seen, from Josh to Drew to Maureen and Francine, they all come from families that love them. They all have nuance and dynamic lives. They all have different stories of joy and fun and growing up, and their stories aren't always centered in trauma and pain. Do they encounter racial issues and racial biases? Absolutely, but that is not the whole of their stories. It's just kids being kids and going through adolescent. They're being Black is who they are, but it's not all they are, just like our students, just like the Black kids that come into our class. So we kind of want to work towards advocating for reading these characters and their stories, because we can use them to actively fight oppressive educational system, oppressive teaching institution, and ways of thinking, so the students can see themselves, and then we can work towards being inclusive and having that equity and equality, and also thinking about how stories aren't monoliths and how they can provide insight for the students that we interact with daily. So we're going to kind of move into like pedagogical practices, because I always believe that you have to do more than reading. Reading is fun and bringing these texts are in the classroom. And I do want to add a caveat that sometimes it's okay to just give kids books to read, books just to read them. We don't always have to have assessments. There are fun activities that we can do, but sometimes we can just foster joy for reading. But we also want students to be able to see themselves and see themselves in a joyous light as they are interacting with these novels. So, bringing comics and graphic novels into class, I also want to tell you that there is a connection to the standards. A lot of things are standards based teaching. We often try to push back against that, and we're working towards the abolition of that. But we still have standards, and we still have to teach to them. So being able to use these books, they do align with the standards. And then usually these questions that go with like the key ideas and details, craft and structure, the integration of knowledge and ideas, and a range of reading and level of text complexity. So we can ask these questions as we're engaging in these novels of, what can you tell me about characterization based on this panel? So kind of when we were talking about Lunella, and what are some things you could tell me just from looking at it before we even reading, kind of like a pre-reading. And then once we get into it, using examples from this slide, and what ways can schooling spaces add to Black trauma? So thinking about the ways that, Lunella's teacher interacted with her, thinking about the ways that Josh and Drew's teacher interacted with them, and even how Francine and her sister having to navigate being seen as one person within the school hallway. And then how do depictions in this panel challenge deficit views of Black kids? So what can we learn from reading about these Black kids, from viewing their stories? What are some things that we have learned that can challenge ways of thinking, whether it's ways of thinking from institutional spaces, ways of thinking from racialized spaces? We just want to start to open up that dialogue and then move into that kind of inclusive abolitionist space. So some things that I like to start off with when I'm teaching my pre-service teachers is, when we're thinking about like rationales for bringing comics and graphic novels into the classroom, I usually like to show them this video by Gene Yang, who wrote All American Chinese. And he talks about how he was a math teacher and how his students learned more from his lectures when he began to draw them and create them and make them visual, and how he found a way to bring meaning into the classroom via comics. And then I also usually follow it up with the pop culture classroom story. So they talk about storytelling through comics and how to use comics for reading and activity and comprehension within the class. Both of these videos are on YouTube. I highly recommend watching them, engaging, taking notes, and then thinking about bringing them into your classroom kind of as a jumping off point for comics into your current classroom space. I also have my pre-service teachers also read graphic novels in the classroom, because then when we once again we want to talk about rationale. So instead of reading a regular scholarly article, I give them an academic article that's written as a comic. So they're able to see how they can still make meaning and still make learning by looking at these visuals, even if it's written in educational format. And then I continue my rationale with having them read the stuff that heroes are made of. So thinking about how multimedia and transmedial literacies play into the classroom and multimodal literacies. And then we follow up with critical engagement, where it talks about the diversity in storytelling and how we decide when we're bringing in these narrative, whose story gets to get told, who thrives, who gets to live, and kind of pushing back on being able to decenter whiteness and being able to bring those stories of color, especially those Black stories, to the forefront. And then we kind of finish off with rewriting the writing process and multimodality as meaningful instruction. If you want these articles, just shoot me an email. I'll gladly send you the PDF. I can send you this information. And the multimodality as meaningful instruction is a beautiful article that talks about breaking up writing and creating comics and creating videos and podcasts and being able to take normal reading and writing practices and making them multimodal practices. So I highly, highly recommend that. So some of the assignments that I usually incorporate, both when I was in my high school teaching setting and as a pre-service teacher educator, is when we're reading about comics and graphic novels, and then we want to think about assignments and assessments, we usually engage in discussion posts, and then I kind of break it up to kind of give them an autonomy of how they want to showcase their learning and how they want to produce their learning, so they can make a book trailer where maybe they picked a favorite comic or graphic novel that they really, really like, and they want to advertise it to the class, so they can make a trailer, kind of a preview of this is what this book about. Or they can do a book talk, kind of like booktubing, or a newer thing now is book talk, where they can do a 3 to 5 minute book talk and a video that centers a diverse text that they will bring into the classroom, a diverse comic or a graphic novel. They can create an ebook where they get to tell their own origin story, much like any of the heroes or any of the kids that they read about. Or they can create an original comic strip, and it can showcase some aspect of their lives, their teaching, anything personal about themselves. And then we also engage in literature circles, where we do small peer-led discussions on a chosen graphic novel. And this can also be translated into doing breakout rooms in Zoom. So being able to, once again, allow them a autonomy over how they produce their learning, and being able to pick how they want to showcase what they gain from reading these books. So these next few slides are just some examples of the comics that my students made in their class. So a lot of them chose to create their own comic strips where they got to tell their own stories, so you can visually see what they're going through, being able to meet their families, being able to see their lives. And they really enjoy this activity because now they've read these comics, they've read these stories, and now they can kind of become immersed in it. And they're able to tell their stories through different panels. They're able to, once again, look at that time, look at that inferencing, being able to incorporate that visual literacy and those visual analysis by creating these very cohesive stories, but very visual cohesive stories from panel to panel. So this is another comic, and then this is another one where she kind of told us about her summer. So being able to look at these different strips and how the students are able to create their own stories and be able to engage in this multi-literacy, and it's very fun. And I recommend the Bitmoji comics because they are more personable, and they look more like you, and the students really love being able to create and have fun with these different Bitmojis. So, some of the things that I want to leave you with is that in order to think about being anti-racist, or to not even to be, because anti-racist is not an identity marker, it's something that's continual. And when we want to think about inclusivity, like, it requires you to constantly re-examine your stances and beliefs. But we also want to have a liberating and affirming space within our classroom. So we want to reflect. So we want to reflect on teaching practices both encountered and our future implementations. And we also want to be dedicated to doing the work, being uncomfortable, because not everyone engages in comics and graphic novels. This may be a new medium, this may be something uncomfortable, but the meaning behind it, by affirming these Black stories and bringing these Black narratives in the classroom, is something we can persist in anyways, and something our students really want and they really need. And also remembering that this is a active action-based lifestyle. It's not a trend, it's something that will always be here. It's something that's for the heartful, the committed, and the dedicated, and being able to make sure that our students have new ways of being, new ways of meaning making, and new ways of seeing themselves. So I want to leave you with one more quote before we close out, from Ghodri Muhammad. Like I said, she is also one of my favorite abolitionist educators. She says that literacy is not just about reading words on the page. It also carries some sort of action. Reading and writing are transformative acts that improve self and society. So by engaging in these works, we're doing something transformative. We're being able to affirm our students. We're being able to see them, have them be seen, but also working towards creating a society that is equitable for them, that affirms them, that has a place for them, that is not always based on a traumatic experience, but a joyful one, and one that they know that they belong in and deserve to be seen in. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Here are a few of my resources. Like I said, please feel free to hit me up online if you want to chat more about comics and graphic novels, or just to chat in general, or you want me to send you any resources. I am glad to do that. Or any questions, comments, or concerns. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you are thinking about bringing some of these texts into your classroom. And I hope you're thinking about reading some of these texts and engaging in them. So thank you for all of that, and I hope you have a great day.